McDonald talks summer festivals on What's on Scotland tomorrow night at 7, and it's the last in the present series of £1 Million Pawn later at 9. Now on STV, and a change to the schedule with flashing images tonight. Boris Johnson The Rise. Fall.
Tonight, Boris Johnson, the personable Prime Minister.
He likes people, and he connects with people, and he amuses people.
The scandals he just couldn't shake.
It ultimately wasn't about bits of cake or bottles of champagne. It was about the rules which the people in that building in number 10 Downing Street had written.
And the final hours of his dramatic downfall.
A lot of MPs who, by the way, owed their seats to Boris, they may say to themselves, look, you know, frankly, was there a bit of a herd mentality there?
Once upon a time, a little boy dreamed of being king of the world. He'd later settle for running just our part of it. Inheriting a disunited kingdom, he bulldozed a path through division and deadlock.
The doubters, the doomsters, the gloomsters, they are going to get it wrong again.
Let's make sure we don't waste a minute.
Even the Great Red Wall of the North felt the promise of blue skies under Boris, but his sunny uplands would soon be eclipsed.
I urge you, at this moment of national emergency, to stay at home.
COVID-19 would plague his premiership with disease and disgrace.
There was no party, and that no COVID rules were broken, and that is what I have been repeatedly assured.
But those words were not the full truth, which would eventually begin to emerge. The talk of cheese and wine, of it being a business meeting, of there being no social distancing, none of that sounds as if it met the rules back then. A string of scandals that would become known as Partygate.
Would the Prime Minister condone having a Christmas?
Boris Johnson apologised for parties.
I apologise unreservedly.
For police fines.
That was my mistake.
To the Queen.
I can only renew my apologies both to Her Majesty and to the country.
But still held on in Parliament.
I can announce that the Parliamentary Party does have confidence.
But a leadership badly wounded could not withstand the final blow.
There came a tipping point moment which saw within minutes of one another, just after 6 p.m, the resignation of both Health Secretary Sajid Javid and Chancellor Rishi Sunak.
Thank you for coming.
But when the herd moves, it moves. And, my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable.
This is the incredible story of how Boris Johnson glided to glory before suddenly reaching the end of the line.
And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
He got the job he'd long dreamed of. He got the biggest Conservative majority since Margaret Thatcher. So how was it that a Prime Minister with 364 MPs got just 3 years in power?
He's worked hard, but he's had an enormously long and successful career.
Boris is a great campaigner. He's a strong communicator. And he draws people to him.
We knew everything, and Tory party members knew everything about Boris Johnson we know today. He was known to be a serial liar, serial adulterer, and yet they chose him for one reason, because they thought none of this matters if he can win the election.
Are you nervous today?
Well, obviously we're fighting for every vote, Paul.
For years I've watched his appeal up close. A ruffle of the hair, a riff in a speech.
I don't know if you've been to Peppa Pig World. Hands up anyone who's been to Peppa Pig World.
He was one of the few politicians people wanted to be seen with.
Mike, cheers!
Where do you come from?
New Zealand.
Okay.
I'm massive in New Zealand.
A crowd pleaser as London's first and only Conservative mayor, and a risk taker whose every stumble seemed to become his strength.
The key to Boris Johnson's political success is that he looked like someone who wasn't afraid to make mistakes. Obviously, all politicians are flawed, but none of them have really made their flaws part of their public persona in the same way.
Oh, his character is an enormously engaging one, which is at the heart of his political success, that he likes people.
Do you like a cup of tea?
Do you regret your comments?
Johnson does feel good brilliantly well.
Go on, have a cup of tea.
Thank you very much.
There you go.
If you can make people laugh, it's frightening how far you can get in public life.
In Swindon, one of the few places, of course, in the British Isles that I have not yet insulted.
He's a narcissist of extraordinary proportions. He really does think that he's some sort of genius, and that geniuses are allowed to play by different rules.
If Boris was a rebel in search of a cause, well, he found it in Brexit.
I will be advocating vote leave.
After some deliberation, he leant towards leave and became its figurehead.
Okay, right.
I think he got the message across really well. I think the focused message of taking back control was really powerful and important, and it really played and resonated with people.
But the campaign suggested he and Vote Leave mastermind Dominic Cummings also had a light touch with the truth.
No, we don't. You know we don't.
No.
Admit that figure is grotesquely misleading at best.
I won't.
But Boris Johnson's argument would be victorious with voters. His win was David Cameron's loss.
A negotiation with the European Union will need to begin under a new Prime Minister.
He became the first Prime Minister Boris Johnson would help remove. But this time, Boris Johnson would not be the replacement. Even then, MPs had concerns about his character.
There was a heavy expectation that Boris Johnson would be the next Prime Minister. I think Michael Gove's team thought that there was a lack of organisation and began to think, well, is Boris Johnson really taking it that seriously?
In your memoir, you talk about standing against Boris Johnson in the leadership contest in 2016. Why did you think you needed to do that in the end?
It was really because I felt that he was not necessarily putting together the right sort of campaign structure.
Instead, Theresa May would take the crown.
I have just been to Buckingham Palace, where Her Majesty the Queen has asked me to form a new government, and I accepted.
Theresa May embarked on what was undoubtedly intended to be a tough negotiation. She appointed him Foreign Secretary, but he had turned very quickly into a massive disruptor. He appeared to take the view very quickly that she was going to sell out the achievement of the referendum.
After 3 tumultuous years, Theresa May became the second Prime Minister whose fall Boris Johnson had hastened.
To have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
And this time he would get his dream job. With his aide Dominic Cummings at his side, staff in Number 10 immediately felt the change in regime. Like this aide, who spoke to me anonymously.
When he came in, it was very much, so much energy, so many ideas, so much he wanted to do, so much like a much easier atmosphere to work in. There was a very masculine culture about the whole thing. I mean, you know what it's like, you know, that lads down the pub, but it was like that all the time. And if you were a female in that sort of zone, it's actually quite uncomfortable to work in.
What was the Prime Minister like to deal with on a day-to-day basis when he first won?
He's an interesting character because he's completely disorganised. He would never read his notes. First thing in the morning, he would turn up 2 hours late, his hair would be wet, he'd have like his zip undone or his shirt hanging out. He'd be just a complete mess all the time.
In response to the claim that there was a masculine culture at Number 10, Today Downing Street told us, Boris Johnson's previous aides, who've devoted their lives to bringing down the Prime Minister, did indeed preside over a nasty misogynist culture, and Downing Street has been a much better place without them. This has since been challenged by Dominic Cummings. Back in 2019, Boris Johnson's premiership had begun with one sole purpose: to deliver Brexit, no matter what.
They confidently crafted a narrative of the people versus Parliament. Parliament was supposedly the collection of baddies trying to prevent Brexit.
Yet again, Boris Johnson would ignore convention, proroguing Parliament, suspending its business. His first brush with breaking the law as Prime Minister.
There is a sense that it was why you needed a leader like Boris Johnson, someone who is happy to be bullish, someone who doesn't pay that much attention to convention, and someone who is fairly happy to disregard the rules.
Unable to get Brexit through Parliament, he went via the people, calling an election with the oven-ready Brexit deal, which had not been to the taste of MPs.
Brexit does unleash the potential of this country. Thank you all very much for coming tonight, and I'll see you at the barricades. Thank you all.
I followed him on that campaign, which once again became partly a question of character.
Can you look at me in the eye and tell me that you haven't lied in your political career?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And
Never.
I've never tried to deceive the public.
Partly propelled by an unpopular opponent, Boris Johnson stormed to an 80-seat majority, the largest of any Tory leader since 1987.
I think he managed to bring Remain voters in the South, traditional Conservatives, as well as those new voters in the North and the Midlands with them. Partly because of his personal appeal, but also because he had a message to both of them, which was get Brexit done.
Standing here on the night of that election, you got the sense that Boris Johnson's team didn't just think he was a leader, but a legend, a Prime Minister with the potential to govern for perhaps a decade. One of his advisers texted me simply that night, "This is going to be great."
I think there was a sense that the majority was so large, they believed they would be able to do things differently. We don't have to pander to the whims of lots of these Tory MPs who we find quite distracting. We can focus on the serious business of the day.
I think he learnt the wrong lesson from that colossal election victory. Instead of thinking, well, Jeremy Corbyn was possibly the only opposition leader over whom he could have secured a victory of that kind, he concluded that he had this enormous popular following and therefore could do exactly what he liked.
Boris Johnson would finally deliver Brexit on the 31st of January 2020, just as COVID-19 was also delivered to our shores. Suddenly, a politician who often resorted to humour had to grapple with a crisis that required the utmost seriousness.
Stay at home, protect our NHS, and save lives.
I think we got, on the whole, the balance right, that we managed to have a lockdown that was effective without turning this into a police state. And I don't think another leader would have managed to get that balance right.
As the death toll mounted, it very nearly included the Prime Minister himself.
Still have one of the symptoms, a minor symptom of I still have a temperature.
First, he fell ill with COVID-19 at home, before ending up in hospital and even intensive care.
When Boris went in hospital, I was certainly worried because the statistics of people coming out of the ICUs were not particularly encouraging. So there was a very, very worrying moment for me.
The Prime Minister recovered, but the memorial wall here, just across the river from Parliament, remembers the many thousands who did not, with Boris Johnson quickly accused of having left them vulnerable to the virus. From a lack of PPE to discharging COVID-positive patients into care homes.
Initially, you actually saw this poll bounce for Boris Johnson, record polling, and that was almost a rally around the flag effect in the early days of the pandemic. As the lockdown ran on, as things became more delayed, as the death toll went up, people started to think, well, does the government know what it's doing? Does Boris Johnson have a grip on this?
A successful vaccine rollout did not leave Boris Johnson immune to further criticism, as questions began to emerge, not just about Downing Street's performance, but its behaviour. From allegations around wallpapering the Prime Minister's flat, to wallpapering over a lobbying scandal involving a former colleague, questions of character returned.
There's a sort of a slow decline in Boris Johnson's ratings around October of 2021. And the Owen Paterson affair, this slow rise of the cost of living, start to eat away at the Tory polling lead.
But then Boris Johnson would be accused of bending the rules even when he had made them. Rumours of illegal parties during lockdown began to be denied by Downing Street. And then we were past this video, which would set the scandal alight. Not just the contents, but the tone. Right when the country was suffering, here were Number 10 staff sniggering about a Christmas party.
His fictional party was a business meeting. And it was not socially distanced.
It was no joke for anyone who believed we'd all made a shared sacrifice.
They literally look as if they are laughing at us.
The Prime Minister should come here now, fess up and tell us what happened.
They categorically deny any suggestions that they had a party.
Evening, Prime Minister! For now.
I personally think it was the partying that did for him. People at every level of our society could understand that this was totally wrong and that we were led by a man of no standards or decency whatsoever, who was really giving two fingers to the people who'd elected him.
I have been repeatedly assured since these allegations emerged that there was no party and that no COVID rules were broken.
The more Downing Street denied the parties, the more sources were prepared to leak a succession of stories.
Now, in another exclusive, we reveal Boris Johnson had a rule-breaking birthday party.
Champagne, wine, snacks. If it wasn't a party, it sure looked like one.
It felt like an island, different from the rest of the country, where the same rules were not being applied.
It sounds to me then that they weren't just ignoring the rule in Downing Street, they were being quite dismissive, ridiculing the rules in some ways.
I'll take from an example here that, you know, there's a leaving party going on in the press area, and the Prime Minister was sort of walking. He finished off in his office and he was walking up to his flat and he would see what was going on, you know, and come and join. Getting a glass of wine, making a speech. I remember very clearly one of them, he said something like, "This is the most unsocially distanced party in the country right now."
Do you think we ever found out about all of the parties that happened in Number 10?
Oh no, there was way more, I think the Prime Minister himself had a few more of than what had been reported privately in his flat as well.
When you look back on Partygate now, what do you make of it?
I think it was completely trivial and overblown. What was the Prime Minister fined for? He was fined for being given a piece of cake on his birthday. I think it became a stick with which to beat him by people who had never wanted him there in the first place.
He was at leaving parties.
He said goodbye to staff, and the police did not fine him for any of those. They were within the rules.
Number 10 reiterated that point, telling us the Metropolitan Police carried out a thorough investigation into parties at Number 10, issuing the Prime Minister with only one fixed penalty notice. He has, to a large extent therefore, carried the can for the bad behaviour of others, including some of his most fierce and shameless opponents. But for many, it wasn't just about the parties, but the principle. Pippa Crerar broke several of the Partygate stories for the Mirror newspaper.
When Partygate first exploded, I had lots of Tory MPs and government advisors saying to me, the public aren't going to care about it, it's a bubble issue. And I felt that actually people would really care, because the people in that building in Number 10 Downing Street had written the quite draconian rules to keep us all safe from coronavirus that we were all expected to follow, and people right across the country did follow, often with great sacrifices, but they didn't follow them themselves.
And it was about honesty as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that's actually been a big problem with the Prime Minister throughout. You can still imagine a time if he'd stood up early on and said, look, these things happened and it was a very high-pressure environment, and apologised for it and appeared generally contrite, that people may have thought, well, you know what, that wasn't brilliant, but at least he's He's fessed up to it, he's owned it, and he's apologised to it. But he didn't. From the beginning, they lied, they obfuscated.
To get to the truth, there was both an internal and police investigation. A fine for his birthday party made Boris Johnson the first Prime Minister in history to have been found to have broken the law.
50 fines and counting, including ones today to the Prime Minister, his wife and the Chancellor.
The Met Police gave few specifics. They would come from Sue Gray. The civil servant's long-awaited report was damning in its detail.
Karaoke, wine on the walls, drunken vomiting, cleaning and security staff abused.
So it does beg the question, are you a liar?
Right, Paul, I think you've... no.
Know that this Prime Minister has lied and misled the House.
I agreed with Sue Gray that the failures of leadership were clear to be seen and that they were the responsibility of the Prime Minister. I certainly agree with all those who say that his position was just untenable.
Many other MPs did too.
He survived, but it was mighty close. Too close, one might argue, for comfort.
Though there weren't quite enough to depose the Prime Minister in a vote of no confidence.
Well, I think this is a very good result for politics and for the country.
The problem there was that he actually won it, but by a worse margin than Theresa May. Now, for a Prime Minister who won a majority of 80 in 2019, that's pretty astounding.
And the public vote was even worse. 2 by-elections lost in one night.
It's time to show Boris the door.
In the end, it was his deputy chief whip who lost the last of the party discipline. The Prime Minister was accused of overlooking allegations of sexual misconduct, which Chris Pincher had denied.
The Prime Minister did not immediately recall the conversation in late 2019.
Once lauded as understanding the country like no other, Boris Johnson was perceived as lacking all judgment.
How does it help if our own political leaders in all political parties finish up promoting people with the wrong attitudes and the wrong behaviours?
This time there would be record resignations as his party tried to persuade Boris Johnson he should be next.
I'm sure I sent him a text saying something like, hang in there.
But eventually, without ministers, even he couldn't remain Prime Minister.
And I think possibly you could say that Boris himself said, look, it's not going to do the country any good or the party any good, to have this internal battle.
At 12:30 last Thursday, Boris Johnson emerged to have the last word, but it was not a speech he'd wanted to give.
But as we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves.
Do you not think the public wanted to hear an apology from the Prime Minister for the mistakes that he was perceived to have made?
No, I don't. He had apologised for mistakes already. I don't expect people wanted to see him grovel at that stage.
He knows that the political position is bad. He knows his MPs have rejected him. He knows he's not popular as he used to be. And I think you really saw in that very sulky final speech just how much that withdrawal of the public's affection is really painful for him personally.
A lot of MPs who, by the way, owed their seats to Boris, they may say to themselves, look, frankly, was there a bit of a herd mentality there?
I think forcing him out over these things is a mistake for the Conservative Party and for the country.
But for many, the maverick style that had once been Boris Johnson's flair had become his flaw.
Boris Johnson's legacy is pretty disastrous.
In number 10, he achieved some great things. He got Brexit done. He's taken very strong steps in supporting Ukraine against Putin's aggression.
The truth is that the longer his premiership went on, the more one had the impression he was just flying by the seat of his pants.
He has debased not merely his own government, but our whole public life in a fashion it's going to take us years to come back from.
History will look back at these 3 years and say, well, it was a consequential and substantial innings, even if it ended in a somewhat surprising way.
Boris, thank you.
Boris Johnson appealed to many people, but ultimately let many down. His main asset had become his liability. While his predecessors were often scuppered by policies, you could argue his fall was due to personality.
Thank you all very much.
The third Prime Minister Boris Johnson brought down was himself.